In the world of art, Claude Monet was a master of repetition. He had a profound love for painting the same subject over and over again, like his beloved water lilies. Monet's obsession with these serene lilies wasn't about a lack of innovation. It was an exploration of the nuances in his subject, capturing them in different lights, seasons, and moods. In our fast-paced world, artists often feel the pressure to constantly innovate, to create something entirely new with each work. But is that really necessary? Monet teaches us that there's value in revisiting the familiar, in finding beauty and meaning in what we already know. Just as Monet's water lilies evolved, so can our own art. By painting or drawing the same thing over and over, we learn, grow, and refine our craft. So take a page out of Monet's book. Don't be afraid to return to the familiar. Embrace the power of repetition and discover the magic in the subtle shifts that happen over time. In the world of art, as in life, sometimes it's the repetitions that lead us to the most beautiful discoveries. In today's lesson, we are going to use Monet's water lilies as our source of inspiration while we explore the medium of oil pastels. To get started, we're going to tape off a section of our paper. This is going to be the area we work into, and those tape lines give us nice, crisp lines at the end. We are going to draw on our lily pads, sketching them out with a pencil. The key here is to have the lily pads towards the bottom of the page a little bit larger than the ones towards the top of the page. This is going to give us the idea of depth. In terms of placement, you can put your lily pads anywhere you want, but typically they tend to clump and cluster together. So group together 3 to 5 clusters of lily pads and have some of them going right off the page to give our brains the idea that this pond continues past the borders. Next, we will use a light to medium blue and rough in our water. Just leave gaps around where the lily pads are. This does not need to be neat. You can really embrace your inner child. Try using the flat side of your pastel to really get a lot of coverage. After that, we are going to use the end of our pastel and plot in our lily pads. I'm using a light, bright green for this step. Don't worry if it's got some other colors that are mixing in. That's just going to add to the overall effect. Once we have our lily pads plotted in, we can go back with our blue and add a second layer. This time we're adding quite a bit of pigment. We are pushing down into the paper and using a consistent amount of pressure, getting a really thick amount of pastel pigment onto the paper. The goal here is to cover up as much of that white underneath as possible. When we are happy with our saturation, we'll go in with a second color of blue, and I'm keeping this darker blue towards the edges of the page and plotting a little bit in the middle. Ultimately, I'm not overthinking it too much. I'm just trying to create some interest in movement. Ensure your water lines and blending are all going in the same horizontal direction. You can use your fingers, smudge, and blend the colors together. There is absolutely nothing wrong with doing this, and it's my preferred method. However, a more professional pastel artist would encourage you to use a blending stump or some tissue to actually blend these covers together. The trick here is that you are merging the colors and sort of pushing them into the paper. You're not removing the pigment as you blend. We move into this dance between lily pads and water. Constantly, I'm going to go back over my lily pads and refreshen them with that bright green. And from time to time, I'll play back into the water. Now I'm going to take an olive green and start to establish some low lights. So I'm focusing on the bottoms of each of my individual lily pads and just adding in a little bit of that dark pigment. With a medium green, I'm going to begin adding some reflection into the water. So I'm just sort of scribbling in a little bit of green pigment underneath those lily pads into the water. To define my lily pad a little bit more, I'm going to go in carefully with a black pastel, and I'm making sort of a swooping motion to get that curved edge of the lily pad. And I'm being a little bit less generous with this pastel. Black is a very dominating color, so I'm using it sparingly. However, I am adding in a few lines into my reflections that I'll smudge lightly in order to get that really reflective quality. Now let's brighten up our lily pads by adding a little bit of a highlight using yellow to the top left of each lily pad. To do this, I'm pushing and sort of twisting to leave like a chunk of pastel on my paper. I'm not using it like a drawing pencil. At this point, I've built up quite a few layers of pastel onto this paper, so I can no longer draw into it. I really need to force that pigment into the page. To keep my water interesting and also build unity throughout my whole piece, I'm going to add in a few flashes of yellow throughout my water. Don't overdo this or your water will just turn green, but little pops of color here and there keep it nice and harmonious. Here's where the magic really starts to happen. We are going to add some more highlights using white pastel. This is going to go on the top of the lily pad, top sort of middle, more to the right. We're not covering up that yellow, but this is where our brightest, most important highlight is on each of the lily pads. We're also going to add some highlights into the water. Remember, it's going to be hard to just draw in at this point, so you really need to be smushing that color in. I don't think smush is a technical pastel term, but it's the best way I can explain it rather than the simple drawing mechanism that you might instinctually use. I'll also go back and forth at this time with my other blues to try to create dynamic, interesting water. Don't overblend any of these areas. Try to let the pastels blend with pressure rather than using your finger and overblending. Monet loved brush strokes, so we actually want to see these really vivid lines that demonstrate so much movement and light. Now, let's move on to the actual flower that you can find on water lilies. To create this flower, we're going to use a pinky red color and make sort of 3 smushes that go together nicely. We are focusing on the impression of flowers, not the detail. So truthfully, just smush in some of that pigment. Keep in mind you want the closer flowers a little bit larger than the ones further in the distance. So the ones at the top of your page are only going to be some flecks of color. There will really be no definition to them at all. These flowers need a reflection as well, so add a little bit of color into where the reflection would be in the water, and now it's really coming to life really nicely. Smudge it in lightly if you need to, but don't overdo this. If you want to add in a few other pops of that same color, again, that's going to create some unity in your work. This will represent some shadow within your water. We're now at the point of finishing touches. You can go back in and add more layers of whatever you feel you need. Do you need to bring out a little bit more of that green for the lily pads? Perhaps you need some deeper shadows. Maybe your reflections need a bit more saturation. Don't forget to add some highlights to your flowers and play a little bit with the colors you find within your water. If your white pastel is getting a bit muddied, definitely take a moment to wipe it off because that pure white is so important. Claude Monet loved color and light, so pop in some little peaks of pinks or purples to make your water dynamic and interesting. Also, don't shy away from those darker colors to help set off the highlights and establish those shadows. And of course, the most exciting process is taking off that painter's tape. Go slow and be gentle so that it doesn't rip your paper. You can heat up with the hairdryer, but be cautious of your actual image melting. And once you are done, bam, look at that. You have a stunning Claude Monet inspired water lily oil pastel painting. Yes, an oil pastel drawing is actually considered a painting.